Okay, welcome everybody to a new episode of PoliticsEh. I might sound a little different because I'm not at the booth. I'm not by myself now. I'm with Dr. Anderson. If you just want to introduce yourself to anybody that doesn't know who you are.
I can certainly do that. Thank you for having me on the show. It's fun to do this. I've never been asked before, so it's a first. I can now tick
There
it
you
off
go.
my list. And we're up in my office,
Yeah.
so that's for me. It's familiar territory. For you, it's a different space to
Yeah, you
broadcast in.
didn't have to go too far.
My name is Dr. Christopher Anderson, and I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science. And I've been at Laurier since about 2006. And before that, I came out of McGill and Toronto, where I did my education, my BA, my PhD. And a lot of what I do is about Canadian politics. And a lot of what I've done at Laurier is teaching either very large introductory classes, sort of political science 101, 102 type classes, or doing a lot of Canadian politics, particularly kind of machinery of government, how things work. But also my research areas are around immigration and refugees and citizenship in Canada in particular. And so occasionally I teach in those areas, but pretty much more of a Canadianist, but always with an eye and interest in sort of bigger questions about politics and what politics means. So This is a great show to be talking on.
Yeah, if you want to feel really old, you started working here when I was born. So.
We just overlap. Okay. So.
I'm just gonna go through a few questions, and you can give me your professional take on them as a political science teacher. So I'll start with the first one. As we know, the Canadian Parliament has been prorogued, and Trudeau announced that he's going to be stepping down as Prime Minister and stepping down as Party Leader. Hasn't done that yet. He's going to be doing it officially, once the Liberals have found a new party leader. But my question for you is: do you think it was the right choice for the Liberals to prorogue Parliament while they search for their next Liberal leader?
Right. The way you phrased it sort of is an interesting way because it's the right choice for whom, right?
Yeah.
So we could think, how you evaluate the rightness of the choice will very much depend to some degree. You can sort of try to abstract yourself from the politics of it and sort of think about the rightness in that way, or you can think about the rightness in terms of whose interests are served, right? And that in politics is really hard to figure out in any given decision whose interests are served, because usually it's pretty complicated. It's not just one set, it's multiple sets. So the one rightness question, it certainly was a correct step. That is that it was within the purview of the government and the Prime Minister to recommend to the Governor General under our Constitution to prorogue Parliament, and then the Governor General has that authority on the advice of the Prime Minister. And in Canadian politics, when we see that word advice in our Constitution, it doesn't mean that the Prime Minister is going to really advise, which means really the Governor General is going to decide.
Yeah.
Usually advice is considered the equivalent of a command, because we're a democracy and power should really reside with the elected officials. So under our system, it is a right and correct procedure to go to the Governor General and say, I would like to prorogue Parliament, and usually the Governor General will agree to that. They could technically not, but by convention, the Governor General usually is going to agree to it. So in that sense, and right now there is a legal case going forward of some people challenging whether or not that should have been done, and we'll be interested to see how the federal court decides. My expectation would be they would confirm that is the government's sort of power to do this through the Governor General. They may decide to editorialize a bit on whether they think it was, whether they ought to or not, whether Parliament ought to sit. So maybe one step back to get to it in case your listeners do or don't know, proroguing Parliament. So the word prorogue, Parliament sits. And when it's in session and sitting, then a parliament can hold the government directly to account.
Yeah.
It can face it during question period. It can ask questions. It can challenge it. It can vote in a variety of measures to either support or oppose the government of the day. When parliament is prorogued, it doesn't mean we go to an election. It means that for now, parliament is shutting down. And the MPs return to their constituencies, and then at a given date, Parliament will resume. So while Parliament is prorogued, it cannot act. Nobody is in the House of Commons. There's no authority of the House of Commons at that moment. That's what prorogation does. It sort of removes House of Commons from the equation of politics for that moment and takes it back to the political parties. Political parties can certainly keep on talking in the public, and they can debate and they can oppose and et cetera, right? So that's what proroguing has done, is a way it's sort of temporarily pausing Parliament And then Parliament will resume at a given date, and we're expecting it somewhere in March, I think.
Yeah,
would be
I think
the
it's
time at which it's going to resume.
I think it's like March 27th or something
Right.
like that. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure.
So at that point, Parliament will come back, and then there'll be a new, what we call a session of Parliament, right? And then ultimately, you can prorogue Parliament a bunch of times, and eventually we have to have an election. And the Constitution, we have to have it within 5 years of the previous election. And by legislation, we need to have it every 4 years. That's in October, that is the next sort of scheduled election. So proroguing simply at this point means Parliament can't sit in the House of Commons. The MPs can't sit, and they can't hold the government directly sort of accountable through the interchange of government and opposition. So procedurally, I think that's the right and correct move. It's possible.
Yeah.
Now, for the Liberals, it's probably certainly would be considered a right move and a good move and a favorable move because before prorogation, certainly the amount of support that the Trudeau government had in the House of Commons probably would not allow it to survive a vote of confidence. And in the House of Commons, you can only maintain government as long as you maintain the confidence of the House. And usually if you have a majority government, that is, you have 50% or more of the seats in the House of Commons that your party has won, then you kind of automatically have confidence because your party is going to vote for you. In this case, of course, we have a minority government, so the Trudeau government has less than half of the seats. As a result, the opposition parties actually are the majority. So at any given moment in time, the opposition parties could get together and decide, actually, we don't want you to be the government anymore. We're putting in a motion of confidence to vote against this government to say the House of Commons no longer has confidence. So Trudeau was facing that possibility, that there would be a vote of confidence. And therefore, the time that you would lose that vote of confidence, he has two options. One is to resign, and the other is to call an election. If he prorogues Parliament, which he did, that can forestall that decision. Okay, so for the Liberal Party, at a moment when he had finally decided that he ought to resign as leader of the Liberal Party and therefore Prime Minister, at that point the party needs to pick a new MP or a new individual. It wouldn't have to be an MP, but a new individual to be the leader of the party and therefore Prime Minister. As a result of that, if he basically had said, I'm going to resign, and he hadn't prorogued Parliament, and there was a vote of confidence, we'd been into election. Because Parliament's been sitting for long enough, usually if it's more than a year, certainly would go directly into an election. So at that point, you would have the idea of a Prime Minister who's already said they're not going to lead the party at the head of a party that's running in an election to try to gain government. And that would be a very awkward fit. You wouldn't know what leader you're voting for. You'd be voting for someone who's not going to be a leader anymore, which would be very difficult for voters probably to decide, well, what's actually going on here. So I mean, at that point for the Liberal Party, it's the right choice because it allows them to go get their house in order, decide on who the new leader is going to be, come back to the House of Commons, reopen the House of Commons. They can then put in a speech from the throne, give its direction, and then see whether it can survive a vote of confidence. Either way, it would have to have an election by October. By law, that's when they must have it. And other than that, there's no particular indication that the opposition parties would be willing to keep the Liberals in power at that point. With politics, you never know. Things can shift very rapidly, and the unanticipated, unexpected often becomes the outcome because politics is a dynamic. It's not a carved in stone phenomenon. Things can change a lot, and positions can change a lot amongst the parties. So, I mean, certainly for the Liberals, it makes sense that this is the pathway they'd take. For opposition parties, obviously, if you wanted to bring down the government and to have an election, then this is not the right choice, right? You would say this is the wrong choice because we actually think there should be an election. And certainly some of the backstory to that is the fact that with the now inauguration of Trump, there is a new government in the United States, and obviously Trump has made very explicit I don't know what the right word is. You never quite know whether it's a claim, whether it's a threat, whether it's a decision. Often it's very ambiguous. For example, in terms of the tariffs for Canada. So the language is like, well, I'm thinking maybe I might do it on February 1st. Right? And so there's a might, there's a maybe, there's a thinking.
When he was asked by a reporter, the reporter was like, oh, are you still planning? I think it was something along the lines like, are you still planning on going through with the tariffs? And he was like, yeah, we're thinking 25% tariffs on February 1st on Canada and Mexico. So
there's always an ambiguity, certainly, I think, often in dealing with Trump, until the action is taken, there's an ambiguity as to whether the action will or not be taken. I think maybe it's a process of thinking out loud. It's probably a process, but politically, of keeping your opponents sort of on their heels. So if they don't know what you're going to do, then they have to prepare for a lot of alternatives, even though you may have already decided what you're going to do, and that puts you probably in that sort of old business school of negotiation at an advantage if you have less work to do than they have to do to get to where you want to get to. So I imagine there's a bit of that sort of going on where he knows how to play that game, and that's sort of how he engages in politics. There's that ambiguity and sort of, within that, often pushing the boundaries well beyond sort of the normal parameters in order to sort of make people sort of really think much further along than they might otherwise feel they have to, should, or want to. And maybe in the end it won't all come to nothing, or maybe he'll impose them. So we're going to find out maybe possibly by February 1st. So certainly in the context of that, one argument is that we ought to have Parliament because there's one of the most, it's a significant moment in time, and it certainly is. And Canada, sort of will need to make some very important decisions in terms of how do you respond. Obviously, they're our largest trading partner, they're our next door neighbor, we have a very long history with a shared border, and generally, comparatively, if you wind it up around shared borders around the rest of the world, it's a pretty calm, peaceful, and secure one.
Yeah.
In other ways, there's always issues, and we can talk about fentanyl going one way and guns coming the other, migrants crossing both ways. So obviously it's a border, so things are going to happen across that border, right? But comparatively, it's a relatively regulated sort of border within sort of comparative parameters. But nonetheless, there are important issues right on the table. There's no doubt about that. So one argument, if you're the Conservatives, well, we should have an election in order that we can bring in a government who will then have a more sort of solid legitimacy in terms of addressing this, because the people will have had a chance through our electoral system to speak and say, what direction do we want? Who do we want to lead us through this next moment in time? And so for your Conservative, certainly you would rather that option because that gets you one step closer to power. So for both parties, there's that element of it. Parties, for all that they certainly are interested in the public good as they would see it, are also interested in power, because it's only by obtaining power that they probably think they can engage in what they create what they think is the public good. So the Liberals certainly want that. The Conservatives, every party sort of that wants to govern wants to do that. So the interest is not so much nefarious interest. It's just that's kind of natural to what parties do, is they try to find ways to either preserve their power or expand their power or gain power. And each of those actors are trying to do that. NDP is just hard to know in a way what they think, because to some degree there's no, in our polling, there's no particular evidence that the NDP is in any kind of surge forward. So they're always, I think, have been more hesitant to have an election come earlier rather than later, because I'm not sure internally. I don't know people in the NDP, so I can't speak on their behalf. But certainly the polling you see, it doesn't suggest that they come out as winners in any particular way out of this outcome. So it's really a conservative liberal kind of tandem, and Quebec is its own thing. And you never quite know whether, sometimes it can move towards a conservative party, and it has in the past under Brian Mulroney. It certainly did. Sometimes it can move towards a liberal party, and sometimes the Bloc Québécois has sort of more grasp, sometimes less. So it's always a bit of the sort of joker in the pack in terms of some of the electoral politics. In terms of there are three parties who could dominate there, whereas the rest of the country usually is sort of close to an either or in any given province as to which party. And some, like Alberta, is really there's an either, not much of an or in terms of who's going to gain most of the seats there. So for the NDP, it's always harder to know, and that's why I haven't followed enough to know really the Bloc might be interested in or what they think their prospects are. Because it's when you're outside Quebec, you don't tend to hear as much about Quebec. Than you do if you live in there. You hear about it a lot.
It's also, I don't think the Bloc doesn't run anywhere other than Quebec. So they would never be able to form a government.
No, but they did in the 90s form the loyal opposition. So that's still a significant power. And at times, when Stephen Harper was in power with the minority government, sometimes it was the Bloc Québécois that kept in power, even as the Liberals and the NDP were against a given motion. He would turn to the Bloc Québécois to keep them in power. So in their minority government, you still have impact if you control enough seats in the House of Commons, and you can be the tipping point between confidence and non-confidence. And every party, whether liberal or conservative, at some point has to engage with the Bloc, and will if they see it to the advantage of their pursuit of the public good. So the principles are there sometimes, but the practice in politics sometimes it's still about how do you accomplish your goals. And in anything, they always say, no one quite knows where it came from. Politics is the art of compromise, and to some degree it is that, right? It's always tempering a bit because you may not be able to simply get what you want, and often that's probably a good thing because that compromise usually means some kind of negotiation and maybe representation of more interests. Yeah. We've gone really far afield maybe from where we started.
Yeah, well, I mean, hey, I do that by myself, so it's totally fine.
You've had me in class, so you know I do this.
Yeah. I'll be talking about a topic, and then I'll just kind of keep rambling, and then I'll kind of come to conscious, and I'm like, what was I talking about originally? And then, it's totally fine. But I think a lot of people talk about this being, like, if they're looking at it from a negative aspect, they're talking about it because it's, like, unprecedented, that at least to my knowledge, a prime minister hasn't prorogued parliament, so then they can step down and then their party can choose a new leader. And, like, do you think that, what's your opinion on parliament being prorogued for that reason? I know in class you talked about it was Harper prorogued parliament so he could fix the budget because the opposition did not like the budget and they were going to vote down his government, and then he prorogued parliament, you said, to, like, cool everyone off, come back, and then they were able to pass the budget. Do you think that's how proroguing parliament should be used? Do you think that using it for what the Liberals are using it is okay? Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's hard to answer these questions because there's not a rule book that sort of writes down, here are the conditions under which you ought to prorogue parliament. We know what prorogation means, but the reasons why you do it versus the act of doing it, that's very different. So, I mean, you can go back in history and find lots of different reasons probably why the government of the day would prorogue. I mean, certainly a foundational notion of the idea of proroguing parliament is at the beginning of a session of parliament. So you have an election, and then parliament gathers, and you have the first session of that parliament after the election, right? And at the beginning, there's a speech from the throne, and that's when the government lays out, here's our agenda. Right, and this is what we're going to accomplish. Usually, sort of, abstract of all politics, the idea is that, governments work through that agenda, that speech from the throne, and when they've kind of accomplished that agenda, then usually you are proroguing, because then the idea is you'd go back to your constituencies, you talk to the people in your constituency who and find out what do people want, what do you say, and you reconsider, now that you've finished that first agenda, what's our second agenda look like?
Yeah.
So as a way to step away, because you've completed project one. So now let's step back. Let's see what project 2 looks like. Let's design it, and then we'll come back to Parliament. We'll have a new session of Parliament, session number 2. We'll introduce a speech from the throne, and then we have a new narrative arc, right, that ends in a prorogation, right? So certainly there's that kind of very neutral idea of what prorogation means, right? But politics is never neutral, and timing is everything.
Yeah.
And all political parties will want to time things to their advantage. So ideally, you'd like to say, we finished our session at a moment when it's actually advantageous for you to finish that session, because it sets you up well in terms of whether either with the issues of the day, or if you see that something a year from now is going to come up, okay, maybe if you get in now, then you can avoid the debate at this time. So that's always been the case. The 2008 case was, we had an economic crisis, and certainly Southern Ontario, people, 2006, if you're born, maybe you won't quite remember it, but your parents certainly would.
Yeah.
I mean, it had a huge impact on Southern Ontario, certainly the automotive sector and this part, all down this beltway, all the way down to Windsor. Whole communities sort of, devastated by that sort of economic crisis of the day. And the government of the day had introduced conservative government of Harper had introduced a certain type of budget, and it was probably less of a welfare state budget and more of a sort of small c conservative budget, right? And because they're a minority government, they needed the support of the other parties in order to do that, and they've of course objected and said, well, actually, we just had an election, and we are going to reject your budget, and we would like to replace you. So we're going to have a motion of confidence, and because it's only 6 months since the election, it's actually legitimate for the Governor General to then go and say, okay, can anybody else form a government? We've already told them we can. So Monday morning, here's our vote. You're out of power. We're coming into power. And he said, well, I'd actually rather not, because again, parties would like to preserve their power. That it's instinctive, right? And so he went to the Governor General and said, well, actually, I'd like to prorogue Parliament. And the Governor General had the authority to say yes or no. And the Governor General, I think, probably meeting with some sense of the stronger weight of convention that you let the elected people have the say, said yes. We never know, like the Governor Generals don't release reasons. It's secret. We don't know why Michaëlle Jean decided to say yes. But she did say yes. But she could have said no, and also would have been legitimate, because that's her power. And so that was a way to kind of avoid the judgment of Parliament. and then come back once again the dust had settled. There was a framing of the discourse that suggested it was actually sort of, illegitimate for these parties to do that, even though that wasn't true, but sort of, a different notion was kind of like they're stealing the vote by doing this, right? And I think it works sufficiently because generally people just don't have very sort of clear technical ideas of how this whole system works. And so he was able, I think, to play into that and sort of reinforce the notion there's something underhanded about this, right?
Yeah.
And it worked, and then he was able to maintain power by completely changing the budget, right? So again, that was not at all about a narrative arc about fulfilling your mission. That was very much about, I'm about to lose power and I need to move. This, I'd say, is the kind of similar. I mean, it's a different context, a different sort of situation, certainly, but it's a context of, to my mind, probably at some point, maybe we'll find out. And this is the thing about politics. Eventually, sometimes we get information way after it's sort of we kind of want it to understand the present, but the present's really hard to understand. The past much easier. Right now, there'll be probably lots of ideas swirling around, but probably to some degree, one could say, okay, Trudeau maybe stayed too long.
Yeah.
Maybe was anticipating that the U.S. election would be different, and therefore would be a different context in which to resign. Maybe, or maybe there's other stuff going on. No idea. Maybe didn't foresee that there was yet someone who can meaningfully take over and therefore maybe win an election. So whatever the calculus was, certainly he did wait quite a long time before making a decision that for many externally looked to be inevitable. But then again, he was always the comeback kid, right? He has this famous boxing match against somebody who's a real boxer, and he goes in and he looks like he's about to be pummeled, but he trained to kind of absorb the pummeling in order to come and do a final attack and win, and he did, and that was sort of iconic. Kind of that's me. I'm under. People have low expectations in me, and I will exceed them and surprise you.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's just buying that into his own sort of idea that he has faith in himself to overcome the obstacles in order to do it, because he has in the past, right? And in that way, he's been, whether you like him or dislike him, successful as a leader because he's been around for 10 years. Like, you don't do that unless you have some kind of abilities, right? And so who knows why? But the end result is that timing makes it very awkward, because usually if a party is going to replace its leader, again, it's not written in stone, but the kind of convention would be, okay, the other parties will let them choose their leader before there's an election. Because if Party A says, well, we need a leadership change, and then Party B says, well, great, right in the middle we're going to have an election, well, there's nobody to run on behalf of that. In a way, it's harder for the public to have any meaningful engagement. The party can't meaningfully engage in an election because it's busy choosing a leader. So in a way, Trudeau's put his party in that worst case scenario that if he waited around, his government would fall. If he didn't want to run for his party, he really needed to change it earlier. So this was the only option on the table at that point in time to do it. So again, the idea of prorogation, there's no rule that says you can't use it for those purposes, because there's no rules about how that's used. There's some maybe things we find a little less or more savory. Certainly, most people will approach it with their sort of partisan lens. So certainly, if you're conservative, you will not appreciate that this is the way it was done because you think it's a way of avoiding. I think if any of your partisan on either side, you would also look to your own party and say, well, we've done that too in different ways. And you might think, well, it wasn't as bad. But again, partisanship's going to drive a lot of that. So in a way, if we wanted it not to be used that way, we'd have to write rules around it, which we could. We could try to, New Zealand, for example, has more sort of formalized rules around how prorogation occurs and how, the role of the Governor General and this, because it's all of this. People and sometimes this notion that the leadership of our country is really closely aligned with the voter preference. And in the United States, you vote for the electoral college. We'll forget that, but you vote for the president, and you vote for or against, right? You vote for the one party or the other party, and there's sort of this direct line between you and that executive leadership. Because we don't have that. Right, we vote for our parliament then chooses our prime minister. Well, the governor general appoints somebody from amongst all those parliamentarians to become the prime minister when the governor general thinks it. It's a indirect, as we talked about in our class, sort of process, not as direct, right? But people tend to, in their judgment, tend to think that indirect, there's something suspect about that, and it's wrong. And it may work better or worse, but it is the system, and it is how the system functions. And so part of it is, understanding the systems, and we can decide, whether we like that or not, whether we want to do anything about it. And so I think the final judgment will be largely often partisan as to whether you think this was right or wrong, because it gets back to the parties and which parties you're supporting, and we have a tendency to think that the our own parties do better things and the other parties don't. And in this sort of maybe more heightened sort of, partisanship age, that's even more so, that we really dislike what the other party's doing more often than not. To have, we'll even paint what they do as illegitimate when it is legitimate. It's not illegal. We just may not agree with that use of that power. But that's always the case in government. It's just, I think we have more intensity to how we frame those and think about them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you, like, touching on, like, partisan and whatnot, and how, like, the reason I think Trudeau finally kind of realized that he had to step down was when it was, like, privately, some MPs were like, well, we maybe don't want him to be party leader anymore. And then it grew and grew, and then they started going public. And then I think that's when he was like, okay, if I can't get my own, like, the same members of my own party to want to support me, how am I going to get the like, citizens to vote for me? And that kind of goes into a question I also wanted to ask you, was about party loyalty. We talked about that in your class of, like, if you're a part of the Liberal government, you vote with the Liberal government. You can't really reach across the aisle. Like in the US, you see a lot of Democrats will vote against a Republican whatever they put forward, but some Democrats will vote for it, some Republicans will vote for it. They're able to reach across the aisle and get to like agree on certain things. And I think if you went to maybe a much more rural place in the US and they have a Democrat elected, that's going to look much different than a Democrat from, like, California, of, like, where they are on, like, the political spectrum, if you want to say. I feel like that is a better way of doing politics than what Canada has, of, like, if you're a liberal voted in a more rural area, you're going to have your constituents are going to want different things than a liberal who was voted in Toronto. Like, maybe I don't know, like the liberal in Toronto is going to have a different view on like gun legislation and gun law and stuff like that than the liberal voted in from a rural riding, where they may be more open to guns and might have them for different uses. But then when legislation is put forward and has to be voted on, that liberal, their constituents may not actually want that passed, but they have to pass it because if they go against it, they get in trouble by the party whip and they will get talked to and get disciplined and whatnot. Like, do you think that party loyalty is a good thing in Canada? Do you have an opinion on it? And, like, how would you go about, like, possibly, like, changing it or not having it or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, party loyalty, again, is one of these things that becomes not so much as a good or a bad thing, it's an intrinsic thing.
Yeah.
Our system is designed that way. It's sort of like asking, do you think this airplane should fly? Well, it's designed to fly, not to drive on a highway. So we wouldn't want, I mean, it is sort of, system design, right? So we are based on a system that is about government and opposition.
Yeah.
There are two firm sides. You get to be prime minister, not because the people vote you in, but because you can maintain support within the House of Commons. If you had to, every single issue, try to figure out who supported you and who didn't, it would be an incredibly sort of inefficient form of government and from the way we work, because everything would be up for grabs always. And so decision making would be really, really hard. And it doesn't mean we couldn't do it that way, but I think, when we start after Confederation, we don't really have the same party discipline, which is what we call, what you're talking about, party loyalty, party discipline. We don't have that. And very quickly it congeals into it. So I think the way our system is structured, even if you sort of said, well, let's not do it anymore, you would still find it. Because you're looking for how do you govern and how do you govern well. Well, at some point you need to collaborate, you need to cooperate, you need to figure out who's on your side, who's not. And the more you know that, the easier it is to kind of say, okay, here's our agenda and here's how we can implement it. If every single decision is up for grabs and you never know if any vote's going to pass, you're going to get very little done. Because most of your time is going to be spent running around trying to figure out, okay, do you support me, do you not? And very quickly the opposition would learn, hey, if we can just get 10 liberals to vote against their own government, we're going to get power. And now your party has lost power, and the party that you don't support, even if you may support them on some things, has gained power. So in the U.S., because they have routine elections, it's every 4 years or 2 or 4 or 6, depending if you're in Congress, there's a routine to when power changes hands, and
Yeah.
therefore there's a cycle to the politics that takes place. In Canada, power can change hands at any time, and so you need to protect your power more. President Trump will be president for 4 years, unless A, impeached, or sort of becomes incapacitated or deceased in some way. Those are the only options. Otherwise, that person is in power for 4 years. A prime minister, as Joe Clark found out, can get elected, sort of gain power, and then be out in under 100 days if they don't manage their power well. So it's a really different dynamic. So that's why the always a question of is it good or bad? It's slightly different.
Yeah.
It has positive and negative effects, which is how I'd see it. In the positive, it certainly gives a sense of the potential for accountability. You stand for something. If you support that something, then you're also accountable for it.
Yeah.
So you stand united as a government and as a party to say, this is what we stand for, this is what we do not. If you don't, you always have the option to say, I want to stand as independent, I want to join another party. I cannot. But internally, one thing we forget sometimes with party discipline, there's a lot of internal debate. So we may not see it. And we may think, everybody's just being told what to do, what to say. But often in caucus, in the back rooms, in the hallways, communication is going up and down. And policies do change. We just don't see it because we're not privy to all those conversations.
Yeah.
So we tend to think about party discipline as this sort of very singular, kind of almost like military type thing. And it's not that. It's organic, it's living, and leaders have to realize that and understand that. And you watch Canadian politics, sometimes leaders will struggle with their own parties because they're really trying to figure out how do we get the policy where we want it, but we can't yet find the internal support, so we have to work on that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just may delay a decision, and so again, you never see that as a individual, a voter, a citizen as the outcome. It's just something didn't happen, and it's hard. Sometimes it'll happen, and yet people have been convinced, or people are convinced, okay, we're not going to win on this one, but we're going to get this other thing that we want. Which happens all the time in American politics. It's called the pork barreling, where yes, you have Democrats and Republicans all supporting, but basically they're all supporting, say, an immigration bill because they're going to get some kind of support for opening a new Brussels sprout factory in their state.
Yeah.
So you're adding things that are not relevant, so it creates its own sort of perverse effect. So one of the things we always talk about, there is no perfect system.
Yeah.
It is really, every system has its trade-offs, and the important thing is understanding in your own system what are those trade-offs. Secondly, what do you think about them? And B, what are the consequences of changing them? Because it doesn't mean they can't be changed, but there will be consequences, and you'll have new plus and minuses. So in the Canadian context, yes, we can do things about party discipline. We tend to have fairly firm party discipline, and it's not necessary. The example I was given is United Kingdom, similar system, parliamentary system like ours, and they have sort of the 3-vote or 3-whip sort of system where on some issues the government will say, okay, everybody has to vote for this within our party because it's a matter of principle of the party. And if you can't vote for this, then really this isn't your party. Because this is so foundational to what we believe that you really shouldn't be in this group if you don't believe in this stuff. You should be somewhere else. And then there's the other opposite end of the spectrum where, this is a free vote. You vote your conscience, vote any way you want, because this is not a principle of our party. This is simply a policy idea, and there's different ideas about how we should respond to this particular issue, right? So that's a free vote of conscience, or it's such a deeply moral, personal issue that it'd be wrong for a party to tell you how to navigate your morals in this context, right? So that's the other aspect, and then in the middle are ones where we think you ought to. Right, the policy, what we're suggesting really does align with the principles, but we do understand why in your riding, your constituency, it may not reflect the will of the people you represent, and therefore there is another principle at stake, which is your more direct representation to your constituents, right? And that maybe sometimes needs to prevail over the party set of party principles, and that's where it's negotiable. It doesn't mean you automatically get it, but let's talk and let's see, is this a case where you really need to take a different stand because this matters so much for you and your constituencies that we need to give room for that within our party. Again, no outcome of government reflects all interests. Often in class, a lot of the students will write, this party needs to represent everybody, and no government can. It's just not possible. I don't even know what that would look like because we are not united on anything. I mean, not for bad reasons, for really good reasons, right? We have all sorts of views, perspectives, and they come and they go over time, and that's the dynamism of politics, and that's how representation happens. It has space for new or different ideas to challenge or become consolidated, but there's mobility. Because when nothing changes, that's when politics is more problematic, because chances are we're too complicated for nothing to change. We need change to reflect who we become and what our new sets of ideas are. So that's the sort of thing you can do if you want. Again, that does affect power. We have a tendency to see that if a government loses a vote, the opposition will immediately cry, "That's a vote of confidence. You should resign."
Yeah.
So that's why governments don't want to lose votes, and they don't want to give it to the individual MPs to vote their conscience because it's going to be used against them. And then the population is often going to say, well, "Look, that's a really weak government. It couldn't even win its own vote." So we also have to change our perspectives, right? We can't hold them to a higher account than we are willing to accept in terms of how politics plays out. Otherwise, why would a government do that? Because again, it's only putting itself further away from the potential to either maintain or gain or occupy power.
Yeah.
And again, parties, that's why they're there. They're not charities. They're not there for, in a sense, the public good. They're a version of the public good, but a particular version.
Yeah. I think the way that that makes sense. The way that Canadian politics is set up is that, like, American, it's like you hold an election, this person's unelected, they're then elected for however many years, and then it allows for some, like, crossing the aisle and collaboration because you're not constantly, like, at head with each other, and you're not constantly competing and vying for power because you can't get any power until another election. But in Canadian politics, it is like you can't really have people crossing the aisle and, like, going against their party because, like you said, yeah, you would just have to get, as the opposition, you would just have to get a few members from the government and to cross over onto your side and then go, "See, you're
weak.
Yeah, you're weak.
And you should
can't do
resign."
anything." Yeah.
And probably population would say, yeah, they look weak. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not that sort of complex sometimes how we respond to politics. And yeah, so the structure doesn't lend itself to that kind.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes, I mean, that gets to another question. There are, the formal ways of doing it. Like when you set up the rules of voting and when parties have to, quote unquote, toe the line, and when they don't. And by the way, opposition parties also don't allow their MPs to vote however they want. So it's not just, we tend to think, well, the government, well, actually, no, everybody's doing it and everybody's agreed. We just focus on the government, not the opposition. But you'll find opposition pretty much votes according to their party. And again, because they're trying to send a clear message to the electorate. This is what we stand for. If your party stands for anything and everything, then what are you voting for, right? And that may be a bit more. I mean, there's some pluses and minuses with that in the United States, in terms of what does it mean to be a Democrat, what does it mean to be a Republican.
Yeah.
Maybe Republicans can make it a bit clearer, but even then, there's sort of divergence within there. But in terms of the actual voting behavior, what am I voting you in to do? If you might just go over here on this issue and this issue and this issue, that can also be chaotic and may not lead to better representation. It's different forms of representation, but it might also just lead to more special interest politics, where maybe that person's voting just where the money is. They could, because they're not anchored by a party with a set of ideologies with some barriers around it. So again, it's just that danger of always seeing, well, the grass is greener. Like, look how they do. That seems much better. Maybe we can never directly implant another country system into our own, just because we have different structures. And it wouldn't fit. We don't have a president, therefore we just can't do that, right? And we have a parliament, not a Congress. So there's just that. But within there, we can take some of the the inspiration of the ideas and say, okay, well, can we get this effect? And usually these are questions of can we get better representation? Can we have ways in which our MPs can better represent us rather than simply this idea they have to just do what their party says? And again, it's neither version is simple. In the U.S., it's not just that they do whatever their constituents want, because again, a Democrat or a Republican only formally is voted in by so many people, and a bunch of people didn't vote for them. So that idea they represent everybody on all the issues that matter to the constituents is not true. Some people are winning and losing in that sort of equation, and the same sort of plays out here, right? The other extreme is sort of that somehow MPs do nothing but simply do whatever their party tells them. Yeah, and it's more. If you talk to people who are in politics, in elected positions, it's more dynamic. We just don't see it. Because again, what do we see? We see the news. Well, probably now we just see some social media. For most people, that's the limit, and that is not a window on politics. That is somebody's sort of cartoon about politics usually, and their interpretation and thing they want to sort of exaggerate about politics, and it doesn't make it incorrect or meaningless, but it's only a tiny piece, and that's one of the great challenges in politics. Is by and large, it's again, I always put it down to there's basically everything around us can turn into politics, and politics is around us every single day. And you can, from the moment you wake up, the moment you go to sleep, while you're sleeping, politics is somehow engaged in how you structure your lives, from tariffs, what things we're allowed to buy and how much they're going to
Yeah.
cost, daylight savings time, regulations on light bulbs, like you name it. There's stuff going on always. But as individuals in our busy lives, we can't sit and do a research project every night on all these
Yeah.
issues, and so we're guessing a lot, and we're sort of making assumptions a lot, and we're looking for sort of answers that make sense to us, but they may not be informed answers, and they may not be even accurate or correct answers. But we're trying to make sense of all this stuff and give it a shape.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll be overwhelmed, right? There's a lot of slippage when we're doing that. It's not about reasoned argumentation. It's often just about, I feel this. I feel this way. I feel that way. It's an opinion, and those are important, and that's how we learn to navigate. But we got to recognize it's a weaker form of understanding. We wouldn't sort of want to do that if we were going to to have an operation, to have it about the feelings of what's going on. We want the diagnosis, we want the information, we want the skills and the expertise, and just the background and the ability to kind of sift through what's important, what doesn't, since there's so much information out there, and that's hard for any of us to do. I study and teach politics. There's loads of issues I know very little about. The vast majority of issues that are in politics, I don't know that much about. How could I? I would need multiple degrees in multiple areas. But we still got to do it as citizens. We still got to figure out who we're going to vote for and why, right? So there's a lot of kind of emotional work, I think, that goes on, and a lot of just sort of things that it's intuition. And when people who study voting behavior, we're pretty good at it, right? We can make choices that do often reflect a lot of things that we value, even if we don't have we haven't done a dissertation on it, right?
Yeah.
And got a degree in it. We can still get pretty far. But a lot of that still depends on how information circulates. And I just think it's harder and harder to sort of navigate political information because the signals being sent to us, there are no filters. So in any given moment, you are not really often, and I include myself, almost ever in a good position to know, is this true or is this not? It's just stuff. And then we tend to sort of gravitate and latch onto some things, right, to try to help us figure our way through all this stuff. But it's probably a lot harder because we're overwhelmed by information. And therefore, how do you make an informed decision? But you want to, right?
Yeah, I last year in grade 12 of high school, I joined FedProv, which was hosted here at Laurier.
And we're doing it again this year.
Oh, that's great.
Yep, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it was really a really cool experience. I wish I had done it earlier in grade 11, but I didn't know about it. But I joined in grade 12, and I was the Minister of Justice for Newfoundland and Labrador. And it really opened my eyes to what it would be like to be to be a politician. I went and I had done research about certain topics. There is a huge slideshow about just for topics that the Ministry of Justice we're going to talk about. All we're going to debate is these bunch of topics. I was like, I can't know everything about these. I picked a few that I was like, oh yeah, I want to argue and debate about these. I want to try to pass legislation, try to do something about them. These other ones, I was like, I'll do a bit of research on it, and I'll kind of get a little stance. And then the rest, I was like, I don't care. I will vote with the majority and kind of in the moment listen to what I think is best. But there was also news stations that would report on news, and I found that there was a bunch of stuff that happened that I wasn't really aware of because I couldn't be aware of everything because I was just doing this work on trying to legalize whatever. And there was something about the federal government had tried to bribe the Minister of Indigenous Affairs or something like that. They tried to give the Indigenous representation $10 billion or something like that. I don't even remember because I was unable to pay attention to it, and I was just focused on what I was doing. And I found from that experience of how little you can actually know about all of politics, and to be able to get the full big picture, you can't really ever get all of it, and just how much is done behind closed doors. And we would go into these meetings and we would debate and talk, and then we would go out of them. And then I'm tracking down the Minister of Justice for Ontario, and I'm trying to get them to help me put a bill forward to pass this and whatnot, and like trying to get them to help me find other people to get on my side and everything like that. Like I was like, if I was an outsider and if this was like real and I was an outsider, I would maybe not know of what was happening in the meetings themselves because it maybe didn't get reported on, or the media had changed it, or had only focused on certain things. Like I think one of the biggest things for me was the Minister of Justice for Alberta got like really mad and stormed out of the lecture hall.
That would be. This is fictional.
Yeah,
Just want to make sure
I
the
know it
bribery
might
and-
sound
okay,
real. Might sound a little bit. I think she was doing a really good job playing the character of someone from Alberta. Maybe a little looking at Daniel Smith for influence, but like I don't think that was ever covered by the media. Which I was like, that was huge for me. I'm just sitting there and she like got up and stormed away, but then they were focused on something else. And like I think in real life, that's to an even bigger extent. Like there's probably so many conversations and so much stuff that is just talked about and discussed that we have no idea of because it just doesn't get covered because it isn't like headline worthy or like view worthy or a big enough thing to talk about, which like you talked about how the conversations between like a prime minister and the governor general are private, and we don't know what we don't know what happened behind those closed doors, where I think part of that is good because it allows them to be authentic and to actually talk about and not have to worry about what the people are going to think about it, and then that affecting their chances at like winning an election or whatnot. But I do think that we're in a democracy, and do we not kind of have a bit of a right to understand what our politics are talking about? Like, why is Parliament used as just a way to get views? And they know it's televised, so they're going to be like really exaggerated and kind of like cartoon characters. But then Parliament's closed, or like they leave Parliament and they go into their offices, and then they're just normal people just talking, having real conversations. Like, but we don't see that, and I think that can kind of divide us because we're looking at the televised version of it and not the behind closed doors. And I understand why it's beneficial to have things private because you would just be like walking on eggshells all the time. But I think having those private conversations public would do better. But I understand, like, I think it would do better for society, but I understand that for voting, it would not do better.
It may not do better for society because then it opens up how are those words going to be interpreted? How are they going to be taken out of context?
Yeah.
Is it important to be able to say in private things you wouldn't say in public, not because you are trying to hide something, but you're trying to figure out what the right answer is. And sometimes you got to work through a bunch of wrong answers before you get the right answer.
Yeah.
So if people are begin to say, oh, you even thought about, you raised this issue, how dare you? Well, we raised it to reject it. We had to get to understand why we had to reject it, and we agree it should be rejected. We would focus on the fact they raised it. And we no longer go. So that to me is that we're not, the way in which, I hate the phrase because it's used everywhere, they're kind of weaponized, right? it would be weaponized.
Yeah.
And it would be used as a partisan tool in order to try to undermine credibility by partially utilizing, it would be in advertising clips, just that one quote. It would be whatever it would be. That's why part of cabinet is in secret, caucus is in secret.
Yeah.
Because the conversation may need to range really wide, and eventually there'll be a decision, and they're accountable for that decision. And that's what we can hold. They're not accountable for everything they said to get to that decision.
Yeah.
Because they have to get there and they have to figure it out. And if you can just imagine if everything is suddenly recorded, what's going to happen is a lot less will be said.
Yeah.
You're not going to get more information. The real decision will shift somewhere else. And then we'll say, well, we need everything they write down. And then we're going to say, well, we need everything that they, we need to be at their homes because maybe they met out of Parliament. And where do you end? It would just be infinite. Eventually, governments need to be held accountable for their decisions.
Yeah.
There are degrees of transparency that need to be within that. And that's part of why we have parliamentary committees, parliamentary hearings, why the Parliament exists, in order to be able to ask questions and have government and officials stand up and make their case. But we have the right to every single thing they say and they do throughout their workday. I'm not sure society's served by that. I mean, I imagine some people would love it, but they would love it because they would be able to use it, not because academics would love it. We would get better understandings of, okay, how does power function? How do we understand why certain decisions get made? And I think that's really productive. Once framed through the media, it's not going to be that. I mean, the media has the opportunity to broadcast any part of the public life of Parliament. The most boring committee hearings, you name it, they don't. They wait for question period by and large, and politicians know they're waiting for question period by and large, and it's time to hit the nightly news. And it is orchestrated, whether you're government or opposition, in order to try to present your best face. That's not necessarily about truth at that stage. It's public, and we're getting full view of it, and it's being reported to us. Are we getting a better understanding just because that's public? No, it's utilized by government opposition and by media as well in order to tell certain stories or try to get a certain spin on things. There's an argument to be made that we were better served before a question period is televised. And you can go back, and look at the transcripts of question period, right? In the 1940s, 1950s, it's different because it wasn't televised. And therefore you had people writing about what was said, and that's a different sort of medium. Once it's televised, it's all about the visuals, and it's all about the sort of, the trying to create the drama. And for the media, it's very much about how do we create this as a dramatic moment in order to really see the polarization of it. It's not really about, okay, what's at stake, what's at issue, what are people saying? If you go to question period, there's a lot of questions that are very calm, very interesting, very informative. They will never be on the news. You will get the finger pointing, you will get the indignation, you will get all that, but that's the least important part of question period, but that's the part we promote the most. So I'm not convinced that we really would, as society overall, was served by that, simply because I think it would just be used. Again, we're not going to sit through all those transcripts and read everything to come up to our own mind. We're going to, especially in this day and age, wait for someone, and be receptive to somebody telling us how we should think about it more often than not. And I don't think you have to go too far in sort of, the studies of social media to know that is not a neutral it's a deliberatively directed process of trying to promote certain visions, certain ideas of the truth that are very far removed from maybe sort of empirical and factual truth, but are useful and can be portrayed that way. I'm just not convinced that, and again, for my personally, I'd love it. In terms of academic, it'd be fantastic because we want to understand decisions. But again, past that, I think it would have a really strange effect on how we think about politics.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be cool because then it would just be like, oh, I can see what they're actually talking about and understanding it on a deeper level. But I do agree that I think that it would then get taken out of context and people wouldn't feel like they could actually speak their mind without being ridiculed. It happened in an example is in Formula One. You have driver briefings where drivers all go and then they talk with officials, and that hadn't been televised. It then became televised, and you had a lot of drivers not feeling like they could speak their mind because they knew they were being recorded and they were afraid of actually saying anything. And it's the driver at the end of a race, the top three will go into a cool down room, and that has become televised. And it currently is televised, and they again know that they have to be careful about what they say because it gets clipped online and it goes out, and it's there's drama between this person and this person over this incident on track, and it's gets taken out of proportion, and now they don't feel comfortable actually just talking and being oh, it was a crazy race.
Well, I mean, it becomes a bit more performative. You're performing for a camera, so you act differently. It's not more authentic. It's a little more WWF, right? But for a couple of things, just to backtrack a tiny bit, cabinet secrecy, yes, but cabinet documents are released after X number of years. So there's a time span, right? So it's not as though some of these things are gone forever. We can eventually access them. The other thing we know is countries where they've introduced access to information, where the public can ask for records. One of the results is simply that fewer records are kept because now they're accessible. And so you don't get better information. You may, and you definitely access information is absolutely wonderful and it's good and a very useful tool. But if you don't write it down, it can't be accessed.
Yeah.
So again, the more we set up, sort of, I mean, again, it's that balance. We need accountability,
Yeah.
we need transparency, but we don't need transparency to everything, because actually there's some perverse effects that come out of that.
Yeah.
Is that it simply moves to different places, and you're not going to find the outcome of that. Then, okay, do you overregulate, and then again, what are we doing it for, and what are we actually capturing, and are we better off for it? And somewhere I think there is that balance, and certainly, but at some point, governments also have to be able to govern, and then we need to be able to hold them account, and there's mechanisms for that, and that's the democratic process. Democracy doesn't mean you're at the table every single time a conversation is taking place with a microphone.
Yeah.
There's no definition of democracy that says that. Democracy certainly means that there's those in power, this relationship between those in power and the people have some sort of direct, sort of direct/indirect influence over who gets to have power, why, and how you get rid of them. That's all the other stuff, that word is a very elastic one, and doesn't necessarily cover those things. That's something else, but it's not necessarily democracy.
We're almost out of time, but before we are, I think my final question for you is, like, if by just like a genie in a bottle, or like snapping your fingers, if you could change one thing about Canadian politics, like anything about it, what would be one thing that like you would like to see changed, or if you could just magically have changed or removed or altered or added or anything, what would it be?
If I was king, but no.
Like, I think a lot of people would. I think like a popular one for people would be like, oh, remove the Senate, because a lot of people don't like the Senate. And we talked about that in class, and by talking about that, it changed my opinion. I was like, oh yeah, I don't think the Senate is like useful for anything. And then we talked about it, and like I actually learned what the Senate does, and I was like, okay, probably removing the Senate wouldn't be good, but I think it probably does need some reform.
Sure.
So like, what would be one thing that you would say?
It would actually build off what you just said, and I would put, and the changes I would make are not, my top 10 list is not, well, my top list, number one list, long list. My number one change would not be change the system. It would be change the citizens. In the end, the system is going to run, and citizens are the ones in the end. I mean, and non-citizens too in some contexts, because they're also governed right by the system. They're the engine oil of politics in the end. And the more citizens are informed, the more citizens. I mean, to me, I would like, in a weird way, I often think about it, very confident sort of citizens who know that. I'd like more citizens with a bit of doubt, with a little bit of hesitation, with a little bit of question, not so much certainty that they always have the right answer, and that what they think and what they believe is actually what they think, because those are two different things. Beliefs are easy, opinions are easy, thoughts and sort of justifications are hard, and that's the harder work. But again, we're all stuck for time, and so we're not all going to suddenly become like super citizens, right?
Yeah.
In some model that the old we're all in the Greek sort of agora, we're all talking together. And that deliberative democracy is a wonderful model, but our modern world doesn't allow us really to do that.
Yeah, I don't think we can all get in like a giant stadium and just have a collective conversation.
Even our digital age is not going to work that way. That's not, for a while people thought, okay, the digital world is going to allow us to basically create, a universal, like almost like forum we can all contribute.
Yeah.
We just know the technology does not work. It's so easy to move it in other directions, have nothing to do with the individuals, have something to do with how in aggregate, sort of, either through algorithmically or otherwise, we sort of move all that information. So that's not going to be the solution to this. But at that sort of level of individual simply sort of seeing, more in politics, not just, it's really easy to be negative about politics. And you can so easily point at things and say bad. What always astounds me about politics, in the counterpoint, is just how well it works. As living again as a functioning society, there are so many problems, and to top to bottom we could list them. But in some other way, there's a degree of stability. There are institutions that do function. There's a lot of stuff that does actually work well for a lot of people. But that's not something that just in life we tend to, look at newspapers. Newspapers are not full of good news stories. They're full of like troubled stories, right? Why? Because we seem to gravitate towards that. But it certainly frames our thinking constantly towards this negative, right?
Yeah.
And then we get these unrealistic expectations about what politics is, what it could do, how it should function. Something about this government hasn't solved the housing crisis, therefore they're betraying us. Well, no, it's very hard. Right? It's difficult, and we're not all clear on what we want as a solution. And if the government imposed a solution, a lot of people would be unhappy. So politics is going to be messier. It's going to be less sort of linear. It's not going to be direct. There's going to be a lot of mistakes made. And it doesn't mean we just sort of say, oh, well, there's nothing we can know, but somewhere we need that balance between being critical But in being critical, we're not always just being negative, right? Because people, and students often have their, on a critical essay, and they're like, well, I have to, they say, I get this essay all about what's wrong. It's like, well, no, that's not being critical. That's just being negative, right? What's right and what's wrong. How do you balance it out? Like, let's try to look at both. No party or government does everything right or everything wrong.
Yeah.
But we're generally very hesitant to sort of accept that complexity and try to work through it. We're more comfortable in sort of swinging one side or the other and saying all bad or all terrible. And again, our partisan politics forces that a bit because it's government and opposition.
Yeah.
But as citizens, that kind of a little more curiosity and a little more, having some questions we want to bring to the table because we want to learn about politics, I think helps, because in the end, politics is the game in town. That's what provides. If you think about the various ways in which you live your life, huge amounts of that are defined by the amount of stability that politics can provide. That's why institutions matter. You were talking about your example of being in the FedProf conference, right? If you were the Minister of Justice, you'd have lots of people helping you out. So you would not be as misinformed or ill-informed as you'd have media people, you'd have a deputy minister, associate deputy minister, you have tons of people trying to funnel information in meaningful ways to you. So you'd have a little help there.
Yeah.
But the other side of that is, that's why those institutions matter. Because the reason that politicians, whatever stripe, whether it's Poilievre coming in, if they win the election, or it's Trudeau or whoever's after Trudeau, the reason they can do anything is because there are these institutions of the state trying to figure out how do we do this work, right? And we don't often think of, we focus on the politicians, and sometimes we have this very negative attitude towards the state, just because it's, again, I think it's an easy target. But there's a lot it does that actually is really important. And again, if we want to change that, then we really need to become better informed about it so we can more productively change it. We can complain that the cows come home, absolutely, and sometimes we need to, and we always probably need to, but there has to be a productive part too. And it can't just be that I want my team to win and not your team. That's not productive. That's just changing teams. And sort of changing some slight direction. That's not really as much an engagement in politics, or really, independently of these parties who want to define things, and again, who want power, where do I fit and what do I want? And I'm going to get some things, not others, but how do I actually think in sort of a more complex way that accepts there's going to be some people who, for really good reason, don't agree with me, and that's good, right? If we get to the point where we all agree, that's probably a problem, because it can only mean possibly that we're not listening to voices that need to be heard. We want the divergent voices, and we need to find room for them, and politics seems to be going in a way that suggests that's a bad thing. That you're sort of losing if you allow someone else to say something you don't agree with. I think we need to sort of kind of configure that so that actually that engagement is the most important part. Because how else are you going to learn about whether your position is the one you want to hold unless you hear somebody say something different? If people just keep on telling you you're right, you're never actually going to learn that maybe it isn't what you need and it's not serving your interests, but you've never had someone actually tell you that actually didn't want to listen to them. So not to put it back on me, but I think in the end, they are the most important part of politics. That's why politics exists, and through which it exists is people. And we fixate on this other stuff, but we need to think of ourselves as agents in that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that, I think of what you said of people feel now if you don't 100% agree with one side, then you are on another side, or you've lost or whatever, or something like that. But I think I've seen people trying to be no, we should have a good dialogue and come together and try to have a conversation and not just be one side, us versus them, not just have it like that of us and them, and have a conversation. But I think what you said about social medias, I think it's really fueled that of it's very easy to get down a rabbit hole and to get to a spot where you're oh, it is us versus them, and the algorithm and whatnot really, really does fuel that. And I think it's maybe would have been seen a bit with traditional media, legacy media, with newspapers.
It's always been there,
yeah,
for sure.
But I think it's a lot more directed, and I think it's a lot easier to fall into. Before, you would maybe watch a news station that aligned with your ideals. You would read a newspaper that aligned with your ideals. Now it's a
tweet.
Yeah, you're just some tweet or
a picture or a
GIF or whatever, and it's and it feels like you have more people who agree with you sometimes, because it feels 10 people agree with me, but then it's 10 people out of 10,000 and whatnot. And I think before you had to be a little bit more like allowing for different voices, but I feel like now, because it's just a regular person, like a lot of the people who comment on politics, on anything, it's just a normal person. It's not someone who has gotten extra education or has had a long career in this or anything like that. It's just some guy that, or some person that was able to grab a mic and was like, "Oh, I want to talk about politics," like me included.
But like if you follow any sport,
Yeah.
go to any like online chatter about a team and think about what's the quality of what I'm reading, and then transpose that to any political issue. It's the same quality, and you can read that stuff and be like, "These people are what the hell? Why would this? Makes no sense." And you read this, it's insane, the conversation, right? And in that context, we can kind of see it and go, in politics, we tend to just think, well, there is actually a right and wrong in a different way. I don't know, but it is that same conversation. It's people saying stuff, right? And which is good, it's fine, but we should also see it for that, is people saying stuff. And I think for individuals, we need ways to navigate through that don't just fall into it. Otherwise, again, you're not really in control of what you're thinking as much. You're following a bit more, and really, ideally, and the democratic model is citizens who are reflective, who can sort of figure out stuff on their own or with others, but somehow they're active agents in this process. And social media, just I think by its nature, tends to draw you along rather than sort of empower you to become an active agent, because it, as you say, it's narrow. It tends to be more about the tunnel than less about let's survey 5 different views respectfully, right? But I mean, I think it gets back to one thing. I mean, politics has always been about identity. People feel their political beliefs deeply, and they feel allegiances to parties deeply, and all that. So it's a very emotional thing, and that's the trick with political differences, is it challenges your identity. It makes you feel uncomfortable in who you are, because if they're right, then I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, then part of my identity doesn't hold.
Yeah.
And that's hard. Like, that's not a comfortable, but that's to get maybe the idea of modesty instead of, I mean, I think it's good to feel uncomfortable, but uncomfortable with reason, uncomfortable because you want to figure out how you get back to comfortable without simply saying, well, I'm just going to shut the door on that.
Yeah.
Because that maybe make you feel more comfortable, but in the end you're not, because that is still outside your door. You just are ignoring it rather than engaging with it. So it's how you do that. And we're all going to find different ways. There's not one model to it, but just somehow that impulse to kind of, to be a little more curious about why people hold different views, and to try to learn from those views rather than to kind of just sort of retreat a bit from them and sort of feel either threatened or just disinterested in them. You should want to learn, why does somebody really believe that? That's really interesting. And do I really believe what I believe? And if I had to explain it to somebody, could I really explain it, or is it just a feeling, right? And again, but that's where we're pushing yourselves to be more political, and that's hard. I mean, it's a bit. It should be fun, but it's also a bit of work. Like, you have to commit yourself a bit to kind of think, I am a citizen. I want to be part of this community. I am a part of this community. How do I do that? And where do I find my role?
Yeah. Well, thank you for being the very first guest on my show.
Thank you very much.
Fun time. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I did too.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will. Hopefully, you'll be here listening next time.
And you should be busy because we might have an Ontario election.
Yeah.
Maybe announced by Wednesday, and then we might have a federal election. So
there
you
we
should
go.
Get busy in your broadcast.
Yeah, I'll have plenty of topics to cover. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.